Hello there, and welcome to the first ever episode of the PsyCare UK podcast, Frontiers in Harm Reduction. I'm Rodri Karim, trainee psychotherapist and long-time field volunteer with the charity. For those of you new to our work, PsyCare UK offers transformative welfare and psychedelic harm reduction. We offer advice and interventions to reduce the risk of drug taking, but the core of our work is supporting people through crisis, whether drug-induced or otherwise, at festivals and events across the UK, and occasionally in Europe too. Our service is based on the premise that with the right support in the right circumstances, a bad trip can be transformed into a meaningful breakthrough experience. As part of this series, we'll be meeting the intrepid souls and dedicated practitioners working at the face of the psychedelic renaissance. These are folks exploring the meaning, structure, and possibilities of these extraordinary states of mind, including the dangerous, harmful, or just plain confusing territory that can be opened up when we take the business of meaning-making into our own hands. The narrative around psychedelics currently emphasizes the transformative potential of these so-called wonder drugs and misses out the real pitfalls that can come with exploring these expansive states of mind. We'll be exploring the wider context of psychedelic plants, culture, philosophy, and experience, and having a go at the eternal question which psychedelics have once again confronted us with: who gets to decide what we experience and how we make sense of it? Our first guest on the podcast is philosopher, writer, and researcher Jules Evans, lately of the Centre for the History of the Emotions at Queen Mary, University of London. Jules is the author of numerous books on practical philosophy, the stuff that aims to make a real difference to our human suffering and flourishing. And he's also been writing personally about the history of fascism and spiritual movements and the phenomenon of conspirituality, the crossover between paranoid conspiracy theory and New Age woo subcultures. His current project is the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences survey, which will be feeding into a research project to map out the emerging discipline of psychedelic integration, namely, how do we reconcile our psychedelic experiences with the everyday? If you've had any kind of challenging psychedelic experience, please do go and fill out the survey. You can find it at challengingpsychedelicexperiences.com, all one word. We had a wide-ranging romp around Jules' own experience of recovering from a bad trip, near-death experiences, philosophy and ecstasy, ecstasis that is, not MDMA, and the profound ambivalence of psychedelics. They can be both medicines or weapons, depending on cultural context. I hope you enjoy the ride, and get in touch if this sparks any thoughts. You can reach me at rodri@psycareuk.org. Now, without further ado, let's hear from Jules. So yeah, we're here with Jules Evans, writer on topics as wide-ranging as ecstatic experience, philosophy for life, psychedelic integration, and conspirituality. And yeah, welcome, Jules. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Rodri.
And yeah, I'm really excited to discuss stuff. We've had some kind of preliminary discussions about what kind of slice we can take out of a very broad experience.
Out of my head,
out of your head, slice out your head. Yeah. Hopefully it won't disturb what's in there too much.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, what would maybe be a nice place to start with is, so this is a podcast about the frontiers in harm reduction. And I'd love to hear about how you came to be involved in this field in the first place, why it's an area of interest for you.
Sure. So I keep meeting people who are new to psychedelics in their mid-30s. I was just at a conference of entrepreneurs, and they're all like, yes, just this year I've been on a journey with psychedelics, and I tried first mushrooms, and they're like 35 or something. I don't know about you, but I first took LSD when I was 15. So I got into psychedelics quite young, and I was almost done with them by 18. Mm-hmm. So I had 3 years of at school of intense experimentation, as did lots of my friends. I would actually say at my school there was a kind of like a spike, an epidemic. It just became the culture, and lots of us were doing lots of drugs. And we were going raving. Going to clubs in London at 16, going to there's a certain vintage of listening, like kind of techno clubs in the mid-90s. When I go jogging now, I still listen to mixes from the mid-90s of like drum and bass and so on. And that was all good fun. But friends started wiping out. Friends damaged themselves from all the drugs they were taking. My best friend had a kind of psychotic break, which was mixed in with his cannabis and psychedelic taking. And I don't know whether it would have happened anyway. But 30 years on, he's still in the kind of underworld, as it were, of kind of paranoid schizophrenia. Other friends, had major psychological problems. Some died, some went to prison. And I also had problems. Like, so by my last year at school, when I was 17, I was becoming strung out because I was smoking so much dope and doing so much other stuff. My mental health was degrading. I could tell. And after I left school, I took what I think was LSD at a club, at a kind of rave in East London, and it turned into a bad trip. And I was with people I didn't know very well, so I was ticking the boxes for how not to do psychedelics. Wasn't sure what I had taken. Didn't really know the people I was taking it with. Wasn't really a kind of warm, safe, sympathetic context. And I became very paranoid and self-conscious and kind of frozen, and came out of that experience with this strong, firm belief: I've messed myself up. Like I've permanently screwed up my brain. And what years later, now researching this topic, I realized that people who sometimes get into medium to long-term difficulties after bad trips often have that very strong belief: I've messed up my brain. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
And that's, I think, what happened in my case. So there were various things that meant, that I believe meant that bad trip turned into several years of mental illness, of social anxiety and PTSD. First of all, I didn't talk to anyone about it because I was in a culture of stigma around mental illness. So I didn't tell my parents. I was still living with my parents. 18 years old. Didn't even tell my friends, and just kind of hid it, buried it. So that made it much more likely that it was going to kind of turn into like unresolved trauma. I suppose that was the main thing, really, and just not seeking help. And then when I did finally seek help at university, about 2 years later, I went to see one psychiatrist. He said this is just normal adolescent problems, just deal with it. Here's some beta blockers. That didn't work. Finally, after I did my finals at university, I had a mini breakdown, was sent to another psychiatrist. He said, okay, you got PTSD from this bad trip, but I can cure you in 2 sessions with something called EMDR. Have you heard of that?
Indeed, yeah, I've had it.
You've had it, okay. So where as he explained it to me, you think of the traumatic situation and move your eyes left and right. He said that we're going to do 2 sessions of that, and also going to teach you tapping techniques, which is what I think Prince Harry does for his unresolved trauma. So you tap your kind of hand and your head and so on. And I thought, really, wow, I've had PTSD for 6 years and you can cure me in 2 sessions. And it didn't work for me. So that's, and I finally did find things that helped me. The things that helped me were cognitive behavior therapy and Stoic philosophy. So that is why I'm interested in mental health. That's why I'm interested in philosophy. That's why I write about all this stuff. And that's why I'm now researching psychedelic harm reduction and how to help people who also have kind of bad trips.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of that. And it sounds like real material to motivate you to make a difference.
Even though I think there are bigger issues in the world, as it were, I know that there are people in similar situations because I get emails from them who they're terrified because they're like, my mental health has completely changed after this experience. And is this permanent? Who do I turn to? And I know that there's still basically no evidence about what helps people. You could go to a healer or an integration expert or a psychiatrist, but none of them are operating from an evidence-based framework yet, because we don't have evidence on this. So the healer might say anything. The healer might say, my cousin also had difficulties after taking drugs. He went to see a healer, and the healer said, well, it's because you were a Nazi in a previous life, so we just got to resolve that. Right. That doesn't make it better. That makes it worse.
That's quite hard to resolve, actually.
Yes. What are you going to do? So that's, so I'm I just remember how miserable I was and how frightened.
And I'm noticing, and not to veer into my therapist persona here, but something that feels kind of interesting to talk about here is the sort of finality of that experience, and the sense of the conviction, and also the sense of hiding, the sense of being alone with, and what I suppose, I'm interested how, like, what you're exploring now, how that kind of counteracts those qualities.
Yes.
Finality, aloneness, overwhelmedness.
Yes. Well, so first of all, the hiding. I mean, that's definitely true. I had nightmares at that time of kind of classic Jungian nightmares of being chased by a kind of monster outcast figure. So it was like the kind of the parts of me I dissociated were returning in a kind of vengeful form, and I was like, oh, they're threatening me, and I've got to be on the run. I had a persona at that time of being very confident and socially confident, and so this didn't fit with that, and so there was a kind of splitting of the persona, which I was trying to just keep up to myself and everyone else, and the kind of very wounded parts of me which I was hiding. So there was definitely a kind of hide and seek game. I think it's so different, like to people now, where young people, like, they disclose their diagnoses on their, like, TikTok profiles and stuff, and that's the first thing people say. But it was not like that 30 years ago. People didn't even really talk about depression or anxiety. Let alone now, where there's like, I'm bipolar and I'm this and I'm that, So that was definitely, and the first time I talked about it to some of my closest friends was I can't remember. Oh yes, I'll tell you what happened. I interviewed. I started to write about this. I started to write about mental health. I'd been a business journalist for 10 years in Russia and in various places. And I thought, I really care about is mental health and philosophy. And I went to do an interview with the guy who'd invented cognitive behavior therapy, Albert Ellis. And I started to write about how CBT had helped me. And I was interviewed by the Observer, asked if they could interview me. They had a column on mental health, and they interviewed me about having social anxiety, and they published it with the headline, "The Man Who Is Terrified of Social Contact," which is like a real B-movie kind of title.
Quite monstrous, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was like, fucking hell! Now this is public, and then I started to write about it more. So that's how I dealt with that, is I just started to talk about it more. And, but I think I only really started talking about it from a position of I've kind of, to some extent, got better. When I was to some extent out of it. I think it would have been much harder to talk about in it, because I was so frightened, I'm not going to get out of this. And I've kind of blown it.
And that's the quality of that state. And I suppose it's interesting in the sense that it's the quality of that state to hide it. It's the quality of that state to keep it to yourself, to avoid. PTSD in its nature is about really avoiding the stimuli that cause it.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of, trying to think of the right turn of phrase here, but it would be kind of against the nature of trauma itself if it were to be something that could be spontaneously healed from the inside.
Yes.
And so it makes me think a little bit about context, social context, and I'm wondering if finding those things out there in the world, like you say, where does the Stoic philosophy come into it? Because Albert Ellis was also massively
into Stoicism. Yeah. So Stoicism did help me. Stoicism and CBT are very good, I think, for anxiety disorders. I mean, they helped some people anyway, and they definitely helped me. And I had social anxiety. That's what happened during my bad trip, and that's how it then continued. I got kind of stuck in that pattern. And Stoicism helped me for that because it teaches you to focus on what you can control and to accept what you can't. And not to put too much value or emphasis on things outside of your control, which include things like status and reputation. Stoicism says, if you fixate on things out of your control, like your public reputation, and put all of your self-esteem on that, then you are going to be the slave of fortune. You're never going to have a kind of stable self. It will rise and fall on every fickle person's reaction to you. Mm-hmm. So the antidote for that kind of paranoia is to focus on what is in your control, your own beliefs. Like, I can choose to accept myself even if other people don't. So that was really helpful. And also the basic idea that emotions are not really created by the world out there. They're created by your own perspective. So when you're the slave of social anxiety, you're constantly just reacting to triggers. And it's a revelation to realize, oh, I'm doing this to myself. It's not the mean, cruel world that's causing me suffering. It's myself. It's my own beliefs, the way I'm interpreting certain, external stimuli, and the massive emphasis I'm putting on other people accepting me. And when you have that kind of epiphany of realizing, oh, I'm doing it to myself, you can choose not to do it to yourself. So that was, I think that's a basic step actually in recovering from mental illness a lot of the time, is like, oh, I'm doing this to myself. This is to some extent in my control. So Stoicism really helped me in that respect. And I then, like, my first book was about the revival of Greek philosophies. That was 10 years ago. And I organized the first gathering of Stoics for 2,000 years. There was 10 of us in San Diego. And then Stoicism got bigger and bigger, and we organized Stoicons, they're called, like with hundreds of people and thousands of people. And it's now become like Bitcoin and polyamory, like, big deal. You're a Stoic, so what? But, and I guess, after having promoted it and written about it and researched it for a few years, I recognized the limits of Stoicism as a kind of way of life. Like, it was, to me, it had the potential to be too individualistic and too rationalistic. And it missed the importance of connections, relations, love, surrender, ecstatic experiences. So that's what I explored in my second book, The Art of Losing Control, which was about how we find ecstatic experiences and when are they good for us and when are they bad for us.
That's a very interesting topic, and certainly one that's relevant to psychedelic culture, which is all about creating the conditions for ecstatic experience. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the sort of risk of individualism there with Stoicism, because as we're talking, it seems like there's an experience of splitting, as you say. There's an unbearable experience that causes us a bad trip causes us to exile certain parts of ourselves. Or there's something overwhelming and terrible that happens, and that the opposite of that kind of disintegration would be integration. And so it sounds like, although Stoicism can support us to remove our focus from things that are threatening, it doesn't necessarily encourage a culture of integration or a space or a field in which something. Because I'm interested in, so the ancient Greeks were very into altered states as well. Each of the philosophers, in a sense, was I guess my understanding is that philosophy at that time was also something like what a transformative group kind of process would look like. There was a cultic aspect to it as well.
Yeah.
And that philosophers were offering something genuinely new in terms of the way we related to the world, and that there was an experiential component to that. So
yeah, that's right.
Tie into all the stuff you?
Yeah, thinking? I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, I the last chapter of my book on Greek philosophy said, like, ancient Greek culture wasn't just about rationality. There were all these cults around Athens, which the philosophers were going to. The Eleusinian mysteries, which is, may have been a psychedelic ceremony. I'm persuaded by the evidence, which existed for 2,500 years, and every philosopher you can name was an initiate there. And Cicero, who did more to bring Greek philosophy to the kind of the rest of the world than anyone else, said of all the gifts of ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries is the greatest, so greater than philosophy. So I was like, we can miss that out in our very rationalist, skeptical culture, that there were these two sides to ancient Greek culture, the rational and the ecstatic. And that's really the question that most fascinates me, all the way through my research, is how to balance the rational and the ecstatic. How to, these different parts of our psyche, how to keep them in balance, how they can talk to each other, work with each other, even though they're quite different. So it was while researching that book, The Art of Losing Control, that, I researched it for about 5 years, and it was quite a journey. I mean, another thing that, by the by, that helped me to recover before I found Stoicism and CBT. In fact, the first thing that helped me to start to recover from, all this mental illness was a kind of near-death experience I had when I was 24, 25, where my family, I've got a Norwegian family, and we go to Norway every year, go skiing there. And this particular year, I think it was 2001, I fell off a mountain, and I fell about 30 feet and had a kind of typical white light, new age cliche type experience of being immersed in a white light and feeling filled with love, and feeling that there was something in me that was kind of okay and unbreakable. And why that's important if you have PTSD is you feel broken at a deep level. Mm-hmm. You feel like your self is broken. And so that near-death experience, maybe like psychedelics, was helpful because it was like, it's just your everyday ego, which has some dents in it, but that's not all of you. There's something there's this deeper transcendent part of you, which can't be harmed. So, that was I mention this because it's not really that helpful to most people, because what are you going to do? Jump off a mountain? But I mention it because it was one of the reasons why I was interested in ecstatic experiences. Because I was like, well, I wasn't just helped by Stoicism. I was helped by this ecstatic experience. So I wanted to know, what was that? What does it mean? And how can I connect deeper to it? And I tried to answer those questions for several years. And I don't think I succeeded, to be honest. I don't know what it means. And I'm not sure how to get that experience again, But at least I tried, I wrote a book about it. And if nothing else, I hope that book, in a tiny, tiny way, would shift our culture's attitude to this kind of experience. Particularly British culture, I think, is still quite suspicious of and hostile to ecstatic experiences. Certainly when that book came out and I was doing talks about it in like Hay Festival or something, often the audience was quite uncomfortable, about talking about mystical experiences. So, yeah, I guess even though I failed to know what exactly that experience means or what I was connecting to, and even though I failed to ever have an experience like that again, even though I've done psychedelics again since then, I do think I made the case of look, these experiences are often healthy, and these are the ways you can find them. But I also made the point in that book, these ecstatic experiences aren't always healthy. that they can be bewildering, terrifying, dangerous. So I'm trying to help my culture to have, our culture to have a balanced attitude, a mature attitude to ecstatic experiences. Not completely averse and hostile to them, not fixated on them and obsessed by them, not naive in our relation to them, but to improve our kind of ecstatic literacy.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great way of putting it, a really good point. And I really like the word mature, and it's not one that gets maybe a huge amount of support from the psychedelic culture as it is. And I'm reminded a bit of what Carl Jung says about psychedelics and his opinion about them, which is that they are dangerous and to be avoided. And that I could get the quote up, but I'm going to try and paraphrase Carl, which is that you can get enough of the collective unconscious, you can get enough of the field of human, possibility and ecstasis through your dreams, through your imaginings, through what happens in the therapeutic process, and to chase after too much of these experiences, in a sense, creates... His point is that when we see things, at that point, we make a conscious decision either to ignore them or to make something of them. Before we have seen them, we can be innocent in our unknowing of the collective unconscious. But once we see, we have a moral obligation to do something with it and do something about it, because we're either consciously ignoring or consciously moving towards something. So it's an interesting way of thinking about stuff. He says essentially, like, okay, well, don't open Pandora's box unless you're willing to take responsibility for what you find in there. So I'm wondering a little bit about what that means in terms of the culture, the context, what maturity, because I'm moved by how your experience when you were in your teens was meant to be positive and turned out negative, was an ecstatic experience in which you started to feel isolated and started to feel overwhelmed. And then you fall off a mountain and have a positive experience. And so interested in the way in which something that was quite life-threatening actually seemed to have qualities of safety and belonging and all of that to it.
Yes.
And so
I think that's right. I don't know what to say about it. I mean, it was so odd, but it was definitely it was definitely the best experience of my life. And yes, it was this amazing feeling of liberation. I mean from the prison that I had made. And I was in this white light because I know that I came out of it and my uncle skied up and I heard him say, "Oh my God," because I was a bloody kind of mess. So I know roughly that I was in that white light for about probably about a minute. And in that time, I wasn't really conscious of my body. And I remember I got this very strong insight that, what was causing my suffering was my beliefs. It wasn't that I'd just, permanently damaged my brain or myself. And that I was fine. And if you've had like serious mental illness for kind of 6 years and then you get this reset, I mean, it's just amazing. And by the by, so I was so high after that experience. I was so felt so in love with the world and kind of, reconnected to the world and, not paranoid and defensive anymore. However, that high did wear off and the anxiety and depression habits came back. And that was really why I turned to CBT and Stoicism, because I realized I needed a systematic way to train my habits.
Which sounds like taking responsibility and sounds like maybe one way of looking at maturity. And And then, it took years. I mean, it actually took years to get better and to build my kind of confidence back up.
I would say, 10 years. And and it took a long time. I mean, I didn't really have a relationship in my 20s. Like, I wasn't capable of it, you know. And in a way, that's why I had to move beyond Stoicism, because Stoicism is all about being independent, but it doesn't teach you interdependence. It doesn't teach you to depend on others.
Yeah.
And, that's what I tried to learn in my kind of 30s and 40s, basically. Yeah.
So in that sense, it sounds like what's going on here is a huge process of learning, of straying into areas of human experience.
Yeah.
That are out of the ordinary, if we could use that for whatever the hell that phrase means, or like certainly things that you maybe didn't expect, certainly things that maybe in your environment you didn't have the touchstones or the coordinates to make sense of without trying to find them first.
Yeah.
Or maybe even having to make them up for yourself.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of going into a very overwhelmed space, and then a sense of going into a very surrendered space, very controlled space, very surrendered space. And then suddenly there's this, as you say, like when you talk about then turning to CBT and turning to Stoicism and then going beyond those things, it's the sound of somebody growing.
Yeah. I mean, yes.
Including more and more things.
Yeah, that's true. But, I'm just thinking, I mean, it was a wreck as well. Yeah. Like, because this happened when I was 18 to a very ambitious young man from a privileged background where there are lots of expectations. And, through kind of self-chosen experiences, I'd become a kind of like a nervous wreck. I started a band when I lived in Russia called the Nervous Wrecks, because that's how I felt. Like so nervous that I couldn't even do a job interview. And so I think this is what I know that there might be one person or a few people listen to this who goes to have a similar thing. They have a bad drug experience when they're about 18 or so. And it's like, and it really impacts them and their hopes and their kind of expectations and their status. How other people see them as well. So, and I can, just to step, to look at it objectively, one of the things that really almost destroyed me was this thought, like, you've blown it. You had all these opportunities. You were going towards this, this shining, glorious future, and you blew it. And now you're in this, you're in this alternate timeline. And for a few years, I couldn't accept that. And when you can't accept where you are, you're basically kind of committing suicide in a slow burn way. Like, I can't accept my life as it is, because it should be that, and it's this. And what I think helped me to get better was when I learned to kind of not care so much, like to shrug, like to not care about my ambitions so much in a way. I mean, but like, when you're 17, 18, your whole world is you and your dreams and plans. And I realized that, okay, like maybe my big dreams might not happen or whatever, but like that's not the whole world, So I learned to get a bit of detachment from my ego dreams. And I just think about it now, like there's a risk as well of like, when you get a bit better and if you start doing work in this area, your ego says, well, now it turns into the big redemption messiah kind of thing. I got better, you can get better, this kind of thing. And that, but there's still kind of like, it's okay to just be, grieve for what happened. Like something bad happened and it made life harder in a way. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be the kind of hero messiah narrative.
Which is certainly what comes out in a lot of psychedelic culture at the moment, and the sort of transformative, the wellness narrative.
Yeah, or the angry activists narrative, You know what I mean? It's their fault. It's this person's fault. It's the industry's fault. And
But it's all about that gap, that huge gap between, as you say, your ego, your dreams and desires as from that perspective.
Yeah.
What I could have been.
What I could have been,
What I should have been.
Yes.
And that starts to now get into the place of when people have psychedelic experiences that are unbearably beautiful.
Yeah.
So how we cope with a world that is mundane and imperfect and in many ways profoundly disappointing and unsuitable for human life.
Yes.
Versus the beatific vision that we might encounter in the ecstatic or psychedelic state. And I'm thinking particularly of people who have truly breakthrough experiences and with DMT or ayahuasca, and then might struggle with the extraordinarily different, the huge gap.
Yes. Yeah. So I submitted a paper with another researcher called Anna Katjius. I might have mispronounced her surname. I really need to learn to pronounce that surname properly to get it nailed.
Anna, if you can write in and let us know, that'll be.
Yeah, she's a researcher at the University of Sydney, and she wrote a great book about difficult meditation experiences, which again are often marginalized, not really talked about in Buddhist and Hindu culture. And she and I, she's been doing a PhD doing interviews with people after mushroom retreats at Synthesis in Holland. And she found that something like a third of her participants, a third or a quarter of the interviewees, without really her seeking to find out about this, volunteered that they found the days after their experience challenging. So we thought we'd write a paper on this kind of, post-experience integration challenges. And one of them was kind of a homesickness, like for the experience, like this feeling of post-ecstatic blues, we call it, and which is kind of what you're talking about as well. It's just the come down from an experience that's intensely beautiful, and then life is mundane, and that's hard, and that can lead to this is something that Mark Aishala at ICEERS, who wrote this fantastic book, Psychedelic Integration. He talks about people having repeated experiences without integration because they're kind of trying to stay up there. And they're doing the spiritual merry-go-round of, experience, try this experience and then that experience and then that retreat and then this, flotation tank and then this Vipassana retreat and then this Tony Robbins seminar. And in a way, what you're on the run from there is sometimes boringness and mundanity and just, the ordinary. So I think that's true. And like since my book on ecstatic experiences came out in 2017, I then wrote a book about ayahuasca tourism in 2018. But for the last 4 years, I haven't sought any kind of ecstatic experience because, I'm just trying to, I don't know. Yeah, anyway. I've actually been bouncing around the world like a digital nomad, so I've probably been running away in other ways. But I just, I don't feel the urge to have any kind of ecstatic experience at the moment. Like life's enough. Boring life's enough. Yeah.
And learning to cope with mundanity, I think, is quite extraordinary.
But as I was speaking to you, Roger, I thought, well, let's face it, I've barely stayed in one place for like a month, so we always find ways to kind of to run around. But yeah, you're right. So there are these kinds of challenges, and I started writing about psychedelics again in The Art of Losing Control. So that I went to Breaking Convention in 2015 and first was aware of this psychedelic renaissance and found it fascinating. And I guess I've been writing about it since then. But I was aware that the kind of difficult experiences that I had are not very researched. And so I started to think about that and write about it. And I tried psychedelics again, first time in 20 years, in 2018. And surprise, surprise, had a kind of messy experience because some of the trauma from when I was 18 came back up. And I went to an ayahuasca retreat. And in the days afterwards, not during the retreat, afterwards again, I got into a very dissociated state where I thought I was in a dream or in the afterlife. And, luckily came back to England and my friends, looked out for me for a few days and then I was fine. But that got me interested in kind of messy spiritual experiences, quasi-psychotic spiritual experiences. And what are they like and how can people be helped through it? So me and Tim Reed, who's a psychiatrist, he actually has now set up the Institute for Psychedelic Therapy with Maria Papaspiru. We edited a collection of people's accounts of spiritual emergencies called Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergency. It's like 14 accounts, and we asked people just to write in their own words, in their own chapter, what it was like, what they thought triggered it, and what helped them to deal with it. So it's this perspective of like the best experts on mental health are the people who, going through the situation themselves, who've lived, it's all about lived experience is the buzzword they use. So we wanted to hear their stories because, often these were people who've been not really very well helped by either traditional psychiatrists or by spiritual healers. And because neither of those two groups could handle the ambiguity of these experiences, that they were both pathological to some extent, scary, involving aspects of mental disturbance, but also beautiful and spiritual. The spiritual healers would go, it's all fine, it's all normal, it's beautiful and transcendent, and the psychiatrists would say, this is just mental illness. And it was a bit of both. So there is a researcher whose name now escapes me, but it's in a fantastic book edited by Isabel Clarke on spirituality and psychosis. It's a collection of essays. And one of the authors in that talks about the spirituality-psychosis continuum. Like, people have long debated about the relationship between mystical experience and psychosis. And they've tended to fall down on one side of the thing. Either mystical experiences are totally wonderful and they're the best experience you could possibly have, or they're delusional and pathological and you should avoid them. And the truth is actually somewhere in between. They're in a similar kind of domain of human experience. Spiritual experiences can sometimes shade into psychotic. That's why prophets and saints can be very odd people. Ezekiel, I think, lay on his side for 150 days in the Old Testament and then rolled over and lay on the other side. Odd. And there's many examples of that. And people who have psychotic experience, there's often something quite spiritual and beautiful to them. There's something meaningful to them about it. Which is why sometimes they resist their diagnosis and resist having medication. So I think as a culture, we need to kind of handle the ambiguity, the ambivalence of this domain of experience, rather than trying to, collapse it into either totally wonderful experiences or totally rotten experiences. If we can handle the ambiguity and ambivalence of these experiences, that can equip people better to navigate them and to see that experiences like I went through, they do have their meaningful side. They do have their beautiful side, but they also have their painful side. And, we can learn to come to terms with them and learn to kind of, steer our mind through them. Yeah. So that kind of mature, balanced attitude, not to attach, not to averse, equanimity.
And speaking of equanimity, what you're talking about really reminds me of Buddhist kind of ideas. Again, it's like learning to relate to things, learning to, rather than being overwhelmed by them, rather than being in them, rather than being undifferentiated from them. Yeah. Equally, rather than isolating yourself from them, ignoring them, becoming disinterested and aloof
Yeah.
But remaining appropriately involved is the whole business of learning how to do equanimity and Buddhism, really. Well, I mean, in terms of... Oh, gone. Yeah.
That makes sense to me, yeah. There seems to be bits of Buddhist literature which talk about having a mature attitude to unusual experiences, which is they are also just experiences. And there's such a thing as kind of fake nirvana and fake jhanas and, you know, and I think you can be too, even in Buddhist communities as well, you can be too rigid about the map. Like, oh, you're definitely in stage 4 now, and you're definitely in the stage of arising and passing. And, you know, again, these things are fluid, and like, it's hard to say sometimes where we are in the map.
But it's interesting that there is a map. So while you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about the default, it seems, for us as humans, when there's an anomalous or different or unbearable experience, is to isolate and ostracize either the people or the parts of ourselves that hold those experiences. And that is, by default, what is going to go on. Unless we have some other cultural field that can mediate or reverse that process a bit.
Yes, right.
And just wondering, in the sense of what might a culture look like that could, like you say, have a mature approach to experiences that are by their nature confusing, threatening, undefined, and maybe stretch our ideas about what it means to be human, either individually or what it means about how we should relate to each other. So these experiences seem to almost like they threaten us, they threaten what we think we are, and they threaten the fabric of society. So what kind of culture, what kind of institutions or cultural, what would happen that would support us to develop more maturity, do you reckon? What might that look like? Not that I expect you to know, but the short circuit, the basic kind of ostracization that seems to happen where people get overwhelmed, and equally to not either, you know, elevate, as you say, these experiences to things that define the way that we do things. And there's an amazing book by Will Self. I don't know if you like Will Self, called The Book of Dave. And I'm not sure whether you've read that one, but it's essentially about a taxi driver in the present day who has a sort of fleeting relationship with someone, has a child, loses access to that child, goes mad, writes a very polemic and intense kind of thing in their journal, gets it professionally printed and bound, buries it in the back garden of that person. Thousands of years later, after the sea levels have risen, that is dug up and used as the basis of society and religion by the inhabitants of the archipelago, is that how you say it? Archipelago of the UK.
Right.
And this extreme, like, vitriolic, and it makes me think about John of Patmos and Revelations, makes me think about, like, sometimes ecstatic experience is taken too seriously. Sure. So what might the field look like?
There's another, it reminds me of, I still haven't seen it, but a friend told me about it. Like, there's a play about a post-apocalyptic society where there's an episode of The Simpsons which becomes the prophetic text.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and there's a first generation, they've seen the episode. The second generation, it's just by word of mouth about Mr. Burns and stuff like that. Anyway,
that's extraordinary. I love that.
Yeah, but
he does that in the book as well with the fast food song, if you remember that.
Yeah,
Kentucky Fried Chicken and a Pizza Hut.
Right.
And they're doing these extreme rhythmic like practices around.
Yeah.
The lyrics to that. So yeah.
Well, I think it's changed already an awful lot since the 90s. Britain has changed remarkably. Towards a kind of a culture which is, you know, takes mental health and well-being much more seriously, and has even almost kind of fetishized it. Like, you know, we're like a well-being society now, and you know, and it's become this. I honestly think it's become like a replacement religion. Yeah, like we don't have a God anymore. We have well-being, and people kind of say banal things like everyone has mental health. You know, like, what the fuck does that mean? And we are very much in a culture of anti-stigma and disclosure. But almost, which is great. And I'm a part of that. And I'm kind of disclosing. I mean, I've moved to being incredibly like self-disclosing writer, and that culture of self-disclosure is the culture now, and kind of everyone's blogging and TikToking and just disclosing. So it's changed an enormous amount, and that's good. But as it changes, you realize new issues, and for example, I think the anti-stigma culture has to some extent outstripped what actual resources there are for help and therapy. Yeah. So that everyone's like, oh, I've got this problem, I've got this diagnosis. But first of all, there's not necessarily enough actual, therapists available on the NHS. So there's long waiting lists. Secondly, there's just prescriptions for antidepressants go up every year. And now I think it's about a fifth of people are on antidepressants. But most importantly, I think is there's a risk that it makes us less capable of bearing suffering. And seeing suffering as something that should be fixed and should maybe be fixed by the state or by you. But these are equally, in a way, utopian schemes. The idea that you can fix suffering and the idea that the state could or should fix suffering. So everyone has their preferred solution to human suffering. Oh, we just need to legalize psychedelics, or oh, we just need full socialism, or oh, we just need everyone to be trained in CBT. Whilst the older kind of spiritual traditions from which we've taken our therapeutic techniques were like, suffering is the human condition. And you can, if you want to really train hard, maybe you'll get enlightened and be liberated from it. But otherwise, if you're not a sage, you are going to suffer. That's life. So that's one thing, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. But so our culture has changed a lot in terms of, I think, anti-stigma. But I also think, the reason there is stigma towards mental illness is these are disturbances. People become disturbed, and they are disturbing too. Like, every society has social norms, and people who are really unwell disturb those social norms. But not just that. They're, when you have serious mental illness, you're also incredibly egocentric. Like, you don't mean to be, but you are really stuck in the prison of your ego. And you're behaving very toxically for yourself and for other people. So that's another reason why there's stigma. Like, people say, oh, we should just treat mental illness like physical illness. But if you have a broken leg, you're not, acting incredibly self-destructively. You're not lying, stealing, cheating, trying to destroy your relationships. But if you have a mental illness, often that is how you are behaving.
Yeah. Which is where it kind of starts to jar with, as you say, everyone's got mental health kind of. Yeah. Because actually, it's not like a little bit of depression. It's not like a little bit of anxiety. Yeah. When one is seriously ill. Yeah. It's different. Yeah, yeah, and it affects the entire family and the entire society. Yeah. So, I do think I am an optimist that mental illness does get its power from from our fear of it, and I think we have made it certainly things like depression and anxiety. We have normalized it. So I think we've changed now. We're less afraid of it now. However, we have been less good at giving people the tools to deal with it. Disclosure and anti-stigma isn't enough. You got to help people kind of, think, okay, I give them the confidence that they're going to be able to deal with this. The other thing that's developing now, and that I see beginning to develop, is a bit what happened with depression and anxiety 20 years ago is now beginning to happen with psychosis. So people are disclosing more about it, and maybe we're beginning to have more of a public conversation about it and think about new ways to relate to it. Because I think psychosis is a big bogeyman in our culture. And that, when we're dealing with people who are really disturbed,
it triggers our fear, our deep cultural fear. Like psychosis is the kind of the anti-enlightenment, in terms of the 18th century age of reason. And psychosis or folly is the kind of, it had a place in Christian culture. There was such a thing as holy madness. But in the Enlightenment, it's just the anti-enlightenment state. The sleep of reason produces monsters, as Goya put it. And I think we need to come to some kind of terms with psychosis and recognize that this is a human experience as well. And it's not an inhuman experience. It's a human experience. It's a place the mind goes to, and it's a place the mind can come back from. And I wonder if psychedelic research will help us think about psychosis in a different way, if people are more used to going to unusual places. And I wonder if the kind of work that SciShaw does and so on, like when people are having bad trips, they're in temporary psychotic state. And I think sitters are learning to work with people in those states. And I wonder if everyone who works in kind of emergency wards could be given that kind of experience of being a sitter. Go to a workshop at SciShaw, or vice versa, just to have a dialogue between psychedelic harm reduction and emergency wards. And I know actually some people working in the area have. So Tim Reed, who set up the Institute for Psychedelic Therapy, he used to work on a kind of emergency ward of a psychiatric ward of a big hospital. Near Tadmore, who runs Safe Shore, he used to work at an emergency psychiatric ward. So we've got so much to improve on in terms of our culture's understanding of and relationship to psychosis. And I'm curious as to, everyone's focused on, psychedelics, you're going to have ecstatic experiences, mystical experiences, wonderful experiences, which is true, I'm sure, that, and that's fascinating. But I also wonder if it will help us to relate to people suffering from psychosis who, I think are often, are really suffering. I mean, really acute human suffering. And so if we can help to help them feel less alone and just banished from mainstream society, that would be amazing.
And that's it. And that's what it feels like. It feels like it's something that has to happen in society. It's a very appealing fantasy in my mind, the idea that you can do it all alone and by yourself. And it's also the greatest challenge to the whole thing. And it's this, like you say, where this natural process of ostracism that is our basic way of dealing with suffering, it seems, comes in automatically. And it's about improving our ability as a society to acknowledge and maybe decide to bear suffering. And that's where things start to get into the kind of religious territory in my mind. And so something, for instance, that interests me is for instance, in ayahuasca culture, and particularly in the cultures that surround the kind of ayahuasca tourist vibe, there is a sort of fetishization of dissociation. And there's a fetishization of really intense, grueling, unpleasant bodily experiences whereby you defeat the body and transcend the body and break the body. And so there's a sense of a desire to become tougher, which of course I can imagine emerges out of the context that ayahuasca emerges out of. It's a jungle medicine. You got to be tough. So in terms of what psychedelic integration looks like as we do it at PsyCare, for instance, and as we are thinking about it from the Western perspective, we might not want to glorify dissociation so much. We might want to encourage more, as you say, of this willingness to bear suffering and what it means to be in a body, rather than make the suffering so great that we escape it. So I'm interested in where you see so like what might it, so for me, I can't escape the fact that it looks like religion, in the sense that so I'm a practicing Vajrayana, a Buddhist, like Tibetan Buddhist, and the point of a lot of that practice is that you can't separate samsara and nirvana. You can't separate cyclical suffering and being free of suffering, in the sense that those two states are part of the same reality, and that true realization of a part of reality and not the other part. You can't. Yeah. It's not really. Yeah, sure. It's not really the point.
Right.
And that something and someone is left out and left behind, and that's not part of what we are seeking to grow. I suppose. Yeah. My question is just about: do we need a new religion? Will this turn into something religious?
I remember I was just reading Mark Aisler's book this month on Psychedelic Integration, and he said he was inspired partly where he went to a kind of Zen, the only, I think, Zen Buddhist place in India, a place called, I can't remember the name of it now. Anyway, it has a kind of, the only Indian Zen master there. And I went there as well in like 2017 and 2018 to the same place with the same master. And it was there that we used to chant this Zen chant about, without nirvana, no samsara, without samsara, no nirvana. This very body is the Buddha, this very land is the Pure Lands. Do you know the poem I mean? Is that in your tradition as well?
Not in my tradition, but it's very, very similar.
Yeah, it's kind of I think it's a Japanese Zen poem.
The inseparability of defilement, impurity, form, and emptiness, and it's
a poem by the kind of Hakuin, the third Chinese patriarch of Zen. Anyway, as to your, and I love that, and it may, I think it overcomes that kind of that splitting, that tendency to splitting.
Yeah.
Do we need a new religion? I have thought about this as well, and I thought, will there be a kind of new psychedelic religion or religions? And there are.
Do they conceive of themselves in that way? Can we conceive of stuff as religion?
Yes, and there are several. I mean, we're in a very fragmented spiritual landscape. Charles Taylor, the philosopher who wrote Secular Age, said that since the 60s there's been a supernova of options for transcendent experience. He called it a galloping pluralism on the spiritual plane. All these different subcultures offering different kind of avenues to transcendence, different paracosmic landscapes, different myths. There's not one new psychedelic religion. There's countless,
which relates, I think, to something that you mentioned before. It sounds like that gives us, in a sense, a decision about what we want to become and how we want to shape human nature and what we think is important and not.
Yeah, and it's a multiverse. I did a talk at Breaking Convention where we were saying, like, you're not just choosing your place to do psychedelics, you're choosing your universe. Am I going to this, self-optimized capitalist luxury retreat where it's all about becoming a self-optimized entrepreneur? Am I going to this plant, shamanism retreat, or this ancestral, so these different frameworks are different metaphysical universes. I'm also curious about how it's going to relate to Christianity, because I think we're less post-Christian than we think. In the 60s and 70s, there was a kind of secondary move from psychedelics to, so first of all to Buddhism and Hinduism, and a lot of trippers, a lot of the most famous Western Buddhist teachers started off from psychedelics. But there was also people who joined charismatic Christian movements, the Jesus freak scene. So this was a big thing in Western churches. They became kind of ecstatic post-psychedelic, and then that was all covered up. The fact that churches like Vineyard and through them places like HTB in London were inspired by hippies who found Jesus on drugs. So this is a covered up history, a chapter in the history of ecstatic Christianity. But there were this big wave of the Holy Spirit in Western churches in the 70s and 80s. And it was, the spark of it was psychedelic to some extent. So I'm curious about whether that will happen again. And I'm curious about the conversation between psychedelic communities and Christian communities, which barely happens at the moment, but it happens a little bit. You are beginning to see psychedelic chaplains being trained in Christian traditions and Jewish traditions, Buddhist, humanist, at places like Harvard Divinity School. And you're beginning to see organizations set up on kind of psychedelic Christianity. So I'm keeping my eyes on that. Then you get some people saying, "Oh, we need to bring back the Eleusinian mysteries." So I used to really want one religion and one myth, so that everyone was under the same sacred canopy, rather than under little, umbrellas of a few thousand or just, a few 10 people or whatever. But now I think I accept that decentralized, rather, fragmented situation. I think unless there's a major societal collapse, that's how it'll be. We're in this kind of stage of late antiquity when there were lots of cults. But who knows? I mean, who would have predicted that Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire? So it's so hard to predict, Rodri, where the next thing will come from. I imagine if you'd asked the Yuval Harari of the first century AD, he would have never predicted that Christianity would become the kind of dominant religion. So I just can't tell what will emerge. I imagine what will emerge will have a very different relationship to nature, and will I don't know. I mean, it will need to be something quite strong. Here's two possibilities I see. I see a kind of dark mountain type neo-primitivism. We are sinful. We've blown it with all our technology.
The deep greens.
Mm-hmm. And then I also see this kind of Promethean, extropian, transhumanist. Let's leave Earth and let's
the singularity and all that.
Exactly. The things, the big things that are going to change are AI and the kind of we're going to create a super intelligent computers and genetic medicine and genetic modification. And I feel like my culture, particularly in the UK, it's interesting, like spiritual culture. In the US, it's particularly in California, it's much more that kind of Promethean, extropian, transhumanist. In the UK, it seems much more kind of deep green, dark mountain, anti-vax, anti-genetically modified foods. I'm personally more Californian, Promethean, extropian. So I'm pro-technology. But I think that, obviously the two sides could do with a bit of each other. They could do with balancing each other out, like not fetishizing and worshipping before technology, but not, and having a respect for the power of nature, which is more, that it knows how to do things better than we do often. And for things like indigenous wisdom and practices, but not going back to the dark ages, seeing a place for technology and seeing that the human story is we're going forward. I think, you know what I mean? We're not going to exist in homeostasis. I think we've always been a species out of balance, tumbling forward. So I think there can be a yearning for a kind of static society, and I just think that's a myth. We've never had that. We've never had a society in harmony. We've always been a kind of tumbling forward, I feel. Yeah. So, and I don't know what, I think psychedelics, in those two kinds of deep green, neo-druidic and the kind of Californian dreaming of the future singularity. Psychedelics get incorporated into both those religions, don't they?
And it's a clear vision of whatever it is that you choose to see, whatever context you choose to put yourself in.
And they can both tend towards a kind of bullshit version of themselves, a kind of romanticization of the primitive, or a kind of exoticization of indigenous wisdom, it's all the same thing. There's just this thing called indigenous wisdom rather than a patchwork of lots of different worldviews, or a fetishization of technology and of, tech billionaires and all of that.
And the power of will and the power of and the mythos of the self-made
the Nietzschean self.
The Gnostic rocket right off the plane of suffering.
Yes. Yeah.
We've been here before. It sounds like we've made so many references to all these attempts from the past to make sense of these things.
And I think it's good to be aware, by the by, of and this is where I've been reading about the history of occultism as well, because I've been writing a history of Western spirituality and evolutionary spirituality. And it's good to be aware of the fact that psychedelics have also been used for as means to power.
Yes.
And you read Aleister Crowley, and he says, he's basically saying this is for the left-hand path. This is for you to become a dark magus. It's about power. And, either you will control drugs with your incredible will, or they will break you. And these are also two ways people frame drugs. They become like the ultimate acid test. Are you a superhuman magus of power, or are you a broken Untermensch? And I think, again, that's a very splitting thing. So if you have a good trip, you come away going, I'm a Teutonic Übermensch. And if you have a bad trip, you're like, oh my God, I'm an Untermenschen. I'm you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm the opposite. And so again, having, being able to handle, maturely handle ambiguity and ambivalence, to avoid both the kind of Übermensch temptation and the Untermensch kind of, masochist trip or whatever. But it's good to be aware of that. And again, in shamanic culture, they as far as I'm aware, they talk about, there's different paths, and you can go down the path of being a curandero, or go down the path of being a brujo, using this for power.
Yeah. Which is, oh God.
Well, I think everyone should be told that.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And this, in the history of ayahuasca use, for instance, as far as we understand it, really, there's only knowledge with, for instance, the Shipibo people, of it being used for the last couple of centuries, max.
Yeah. In
that very small area. It's not really moved out of, it's very, very recently, and with the pressure on tourism, that it's become seen mostly as a healing thing. And before that, it was seen as a weapon, as a tool for dark magic, as something that shamans who are interested in power would take in order to gain more power, so that they could attack other shamans and perpetuate. Exactly. So, in a sense, I think that's a very nuanced and important point, that we can be told both.
And I think even Humphrey Osmond said that. I mean, I read his letters with Aldous Huxley, which is a fantastic book. And he says something like, I think it was Osmond, that there is this, everyone working with psychedelics needs to be warned of this of these power aspects, and the temptation of that they can make to people towards their egos. And what's happening is, very rich entrepreneurs are taking them, and it's just, I think there's real risk of it's just totally feeding their egos in unhealthy ways for them and for their societies. But it could just as equally be psychedelic researchers, I think, can go on ego trips, and psychedelic psychiatrists, and all these people can go on big ego trips. Apparently, I interviewed someone who works on harm reduction in 5-MeO-DMT, Victoria Weschner, I think I pronounced her surname right. And she talked about this epidemic of messiah complexes among 5-MeO DMT facilitators. She said, and I said, what, multiple cases where people think they're the messiah? And she's like, yes, there's been multiple cases.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, so I better mention just this year, I've started this project to research challenging psychedelic experiences. And we have this website, challengingpsychedelicexperiences.com, and it's a study of difficult psychedelic experiences, as in where the difficulties last for longer than a day, beyond the trip itself. Could be for a week, a month, a year, whatever. And we want to know what those experiences are like, what kind of difficulties they can come up, and what helps people. So again, it's like lived experience, focused on the individual as we want to hear about their experience and what they found helpful. So we're doing an online survey and then follow on interviews, face-to-face interviews with people. And that's a team with it's about 8 people in the team, from David Luke and Rosalind McAlpine and Ashley Murphy-Beener and Katrina Michelle and others. So we're doing that this year, which is a new thing for me as someone from the humanities, but I'm basically it's me plus 7 psychologists. So it's so the hope is that we find out information about what these experiences are like, and then we can maybe begin to match different types of difficulties. These group of people all had panic attacks and social anxiety, and quite a few of them were helped by this kind of intervention. Or these kind of people all had dissociation, and they, do you know what I mean? Matching certain clusters of problems with certain types of intervention. So, that's what we're doing.
And it'll be interesting because a lot of the examples that you've listed there I'm very aware that we're talking about a psychedelic experience and then talking about very non-psychedelic means of making sense of those, in a sense. Ones which bring in human agency and bring in our capacity for meaning making. Yeah, I mean, we're in dialogues with our subconscious or our imagination or with the divine, and it's not just that meaning is handed to you on these experiences. There is a kind of co-creation. Thank you very much, Jules. Probably a very good place to leave it on that kind of note of discovering the technologies of making sense of these experiences.
Thank you, Rodri. If anyone's listening to this and they'd like to take part in the survey, I'd really appreciate that. If you've had a kind of difficult experience where the difficulties lasted for longer than a day, you can find the survey at challengingpsychedelicexperiences.com. The book on spiritual emergencies, which is not just about psychedelic spiritual emergencies, but often spontaneous or after a meditation retreat or that kind of thing. That's breaking open. And we have a newsletter. It's a Substack, Ecstatic Integration. So they might want to subscribe to that as well.
Yeah, all amazing resources for people seeking to make sense of their own lives and experiences and grow their capacity for being human.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like a task for us all. But thank you, Jules. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Rodri. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and see you again soon.
Right, you heard the fella. You can head to challengingpsychedelicexperiences.com if you'd like to contribute to that research. And if you have a psychedelic experience, challenging or otherwise, that you'd like to unpack and explore in the company of other voyagers and questioners and seekers in a supportive peer-led environment, we have our monthly Psychedelic Integration Circle, which is online, and you can find more information about that at PsyCareUK.org and click on the link to integration. And that's it from me this time. Thank you to Jules, our most esteemed guest, and keep an eye out for the next episode. And coming down that pipeline, we've got so far a psychedelic psychoanalyst working politically to make sense of how we might legalize psilocybin in society. We've got a 5-MeO DMT researcher, that's toad venom, psychedelic vertebrates, conservation, and the politics of extremely intense experiences. and more. If you or someone you know would like to be on the podcast who has something interesting to contribute to the discussion of psychedelic harm reduction and how we make sense of this truly extraordinary experience that we have unlocked and that the plant world gives us, then do feel free to get in touch. Again, my email is rodri@psycareuk.org, RHODRI@psycareuk.org. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, or maybe you'll hear me next time. I guess that's the more appropriate thing to say. Thank you for listening, and happy